Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 2 of our course. So I've enjoyed what you've posted on the discussion board. It's been fun to get to know all of you a little bit, and some of you who I've known from other classes, of course. But it was kind of cool too to see that you all have really direct connections to agriculture. Some of you live on farms. Many of you produce your own food, or you grow things for other purposes, like you, Leah. I thought that was really neat. Or you have direct relatives, friends, or neighbors even who are involved in agriculture. So I'm looking forward to hearing all of your insights as this course develops over the next few weeks. I actually haven't graded any of your focus questions yet, but plenty of you got them in quite early. And I should probably state too that New York State has a policy on absences for religious holidays. Today's Easter, and if you wanted to take off time for Easter or Passover, I can certainly take the first week's focus questions, a couple days late or something. But if for any reason you aren't able to get them in by tonight, just let me know, talk to me, and we can work something out. Okay. So I posted the assignment for the final paper now too. It's on the top of the Vankel Hall page, along with a PowerPoint that I put together a few years ago on paper writing. So those of you who I've had in class before, you've seen that PowerPoint. It's narrated. You just click play slideshow and you hear me talking over it. But the gist of that PowerPoint is that I want you all to be excited about the final paper, not intimidated by it. So I want you to do research in scholarly sources on a topic within 20th century agriculture that you care about. And I want you to have a clear, direct point to your paper. So I want these papers to ultimately be projects you're proud of, that you might even develop more later in life or in your education. So as you're writing, make sure not to just describe something, but have a reason why it's important. That's your thesis statement. Have a reason why we need to know about this topic. So once you've made your point, you need to tell a story, illustrate that point. Basically, you need to describe the history of how that point came to be important, or how some aspect of whatever history you're looking at came to be. So if you can have specific examples with specific people and places, that's even better. If this all seems just way too broad, I have a few specific questions that you may choose to answer. You're not required to, but I give you a few options for topics that you might work within, and that's on the paper assignment that's at the top of the Vankel Hall page right now. So and since you all really do have ties to agriculture, I want to be clear too that I want you to do research in scholarly sources, but as long as you have some scholarly resources, I'm okay with you using your own family members as sources, your own experiences. So I will want you all to give me a proposal for this paper a week before it's due, but realistically, you probably want to start getting your ideas together now. So feel free to chat with me as you're formulating ideas too. Remember, I have office hours every Monday through Friday from 9 to 10 a.m. at the Zoom link at the top of our Vankel Hall page. Okay, so I want to shrink myself a little bit now. So I've got two pictures on this slide that really represent what I'm going for with this week's lecture. I want to show the effects of the agricultural revolution in the developed world during the first decades of the 20th century, a revolution that was largely centered in the United States of America for reasons of access to land, people, technologies, and economic systems that we talked about last week. But the innovations of this period were shared across the developed world. So the picture on the left shows a German armament factory during the First World War. And specifically, this is a factory that is synthesizing large amounts of ammonia nitrate for the purpose of making explosives. So one reason that Germans pushed so hard to develop the effective Haber-Bosch method of atmospheric nitrogen fixation is that they knew, in event of war, that the British Royal Navy would be able to cut them off from supplies of ammonia nitrate-rich guano from South America. So ammonium nitrate, it's a key ingredient in gunpowder and explosives, as well as synthetic fertilizers. So I find it so symbolic and inspiring that the same method that fueled a horrific world war could also provide the fertilizer needed for a post-war agricultural boom. It's very reminiscent of the symbolism that it perhaps comes earliest from the book of Isaiah in the Bible, that talks about beating swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks, basically transforming weapons of war into tools of peace. So that's literally what occurred in the aftermath of World War One, when munitions producers became fertilizer producers. So an effect of this ultimate agricultural revolution is in the second picture. So this second picture is a drawing of Delhi. I should get my face out of the way. In the year 1887. And one thing that always stuns me whenever you see pictures of really anywhere in the Northeast in the late 19th century, early 20th century, is just how everything is clear cut. I mean, all of our beautiful forested Catskill mountains were basically bare at the end of the 19th century. This and one of the reasons for that is that farmers were desperate to eke out a living. So what is ironic is that today, 100 plus years later, the Northeast is essentially reforested. While agricultural productivity in our country is exponentially higher than it ever was. And one of the key reasons for that is this picture on the left, the synthesization of atmospheric nitrogen that has absolutely revolutionized agricultural productivity. So, and this picture here is taken just a few years before our college was founded. So, and a little bit of nostalgia there. All right. So, oh, let me shift forward here. Come on. There we go. So one of the things that I actually meant to do last week and just forgot was to really describe the pictures in the first slide that I gave you. And I want to contextualize them. So now that you're a week into the course and more familiar with the readings and where we're going, hopefully these pictures might make a bit more sense to you. So I want to go over them really to help ground you in the course as well. So this, consider what I'm about to do for the next couple of minutes, a nice preview of everywhere we're going to be in this course. So on the top left corner, you've got an idealized painting of George Washington Carver, who we read about last week. He's depicted as an intelligent yet humble person whose zeal for science is matched by his reverence for nature. So as you read about last week, he was a cutting-edge scientist who realized his duty wasn't just to science for science's sake, but to humanity in general and his own African American people in particular. So the portrait of Carver bears a lot of similarity to the famous black and white photograph in the middle of Norman Borlaug. So Borlaug's research in Mexico in the 1940s, through the 1980s, would lead to improved varieties of wheat that, combined with new farming techniques and inputs, would lead to what's been called the Green Revolution, where agriculture globally expanded production at exponential rates in the second half of the 20th century. Your readings this week foreshadow that. The picture on the far right then is of combines harvesting soybeans in Iowa. And it's a real picture. There are really that many gigantic combines in these, fields that they measure by the square mile, all working at once. In the Midwest, custom machinery operators, they will amass massive amounts of machinery to be able to quickly harvest many square miles of cropland when optimal weather conditions occur. So on the top row, then I skipped over this 1920s era advertisement for a case. It's a case 1220 tractor, which is or 1230. So conditions and technologies became ideal in the early part of the 20th century for massive moto mechanization, as Mazoyer and Rudart call it, to first happen in North America, then to quickly spread to the rest of the developed world, then to the developing world. So on the bottom left, I've got an idealized picture. It's a propaganda poster of moto mechanization in the USSR from 1930. So the caption reads "Komsomoltsi," which was a Soviet club for teenagers and young adults, onward to shock planting action. I mean, it's These are all like communist speak. It's, komsomolцы na udarny siev. It sounds better in Russian. But this this poster comes from the height of the Soviet campaign to collectivize agriculture, meaning to have the state take over private agriculture. And it was a colossal failure, causing millions of deaths. Any Soviet citizen seeing this poster in the year 1930 would have likely shaken their heads at the fake propaganda. In fact, very few tractors were available for anyone, anywhere. Up until the end of the Soviet Union, despite collectivization, massive amounts of food didn't come from their collective farms at all, but from small private plots, which I'm wondering, they might have been something similar to what Laura mentioned in the discussion board that her mom lived on. So the next picture then would likely have similarly annoyed Chinese peasants during the Great Leap Forward. It's from 1960, the time of Mao's Great Leap Forward, which was an attempt to collectivize agriculture that caused at least 20 million Chinese deaths. It was a colossal failure. So China in this period too had far more tractors in propaganda posters than in real life. We'll spend a lot of time in this course discussing agriculture in China and the Soviet Union. The next picture then foreshadows what we'll be looking at the end of the semester. It's a group of farmers and scientists in Bangladesh in front of a test plot of PT Brindle variety eggplant. So PT Brindle is the first genetically modified variant of eggplant that's been available on the market. Its yields are far greater than traditional varieties of eggplant, and it requires, this is really key for Bangladeshis, it requires minimum insecticides as it's been modified for pest resistance. So this variety, PT Brindle, when they tried to introduce it in India, people protested and the government decided not to approve it. Many Indians continue to worry about possible health and environmental effects of GMO foods, frankly, as do people across the developed world. In Bangladesh, by contrast, the Minister of Agriculture has happily adopted this variety. And farmers in Bangladesh overwhelmingly have taken it up. Bangladesh is far more rural with much higher poverty than India. Farmers there accept the scientific consensus that there is no evidence of, despite test after test, of any harm to humans from GMO crops. And they're frankly grateful for the ability of this variety in particular to lift struggling farmers out of poverty. I'm sure you're all aware of controversies surrounding GMOs. So I'd actually be curious to hear what you or your parents might have to say about this variety. Hadassah, you mentioned in the discussion board that your parents were eggplant farmers in Guyana, which is really cool. So then the last picture on the right is of an organic farming cooperative in the city of Detroit called D-Town. The cooperative is called D-Town. So many such organizations have sprung up around our country, and in Detroit in particular in recent years, as a form of resistance against food deserts, areas where you do not have access to, reasonable access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So, and there are parts of Detroit that have no reasonable access to grocery stores at all. So to revitalize their communities, people have taken initiative on their own, and it's inspiring to see. We have projects like this right here in the Catskills. Claire actually mentioned living on such a project in her introduction this week, which is cool, and I'm curious to hear more about it. And I know you've mentioned that in a previous class as well. So, okay, that was a lengthy but I hope useful aside to really ground us in where this course is going. So now I'll put myself right at the end of this sprayer here. So I wanted to give you a pictorial overview of what we'll be dealing with over the remaining 5 weeks. Massive global changes, some colossal famine-inducing failures, and the complexity and competing discourses of our modern food systems, where some people have to fight to be included. So I want to start with the Václav Smil reading this week, which I changed the pages from what I had originally put in the syllabus. I gave you more of this reading, but I didn't increase your overall pages for this week. I cut some readings out of the Mazoyer and or Mazoyer and Boudor reading. They're French. So People have known about the need to enrich the soil for thousands of years. We have agricultural advice preserved from the Sumerians, from the Romans, for example, who understood the Romans well understood the value of animal waste, of crop rotations with legumes, which naturally fixate nitrogen. Um, and they understood the necessity of lime for increasing crop yields. But it was the advances of the 19th century, following the revolutions of the late 18th century, that really established the discipline of modern chemistry, both organic and inorganic, that led to a stunning set of breakthroughs. So it was only in the 1770s, for example, that the principles of photosynthesis were first figured out. It's not as if people didn't know for thousands of years that plants need water, good soil, and sunlight, but being able to show exactly how it worked was something that experiments in the 1770s were able to do. Um, and it was around the same period that researchers discovered nitrogen, and they quickly, surmised that it was the element that made up the majority of the air we breathe. It's why the sky is blue. So over the next few decades, researchers in German speaking areas of the world, um, Sweden, the UK, France, and the United States, would rapidly determine that minerals like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK, the three numbers listed whenever you buy fertilizer, were crucial for plant growth. By the end of the century, they would understand the key role of nitrogen in these processes. So, one key reason so much research developed in this period was the simultaneous development of international science, where you suddenly had modern universities, the organization of modern universities, especially in German speaking parts of the world, international science journals, and conferences that allowed for cooperation across national borders. You basically had smart people not working in isolation anymore, but really getting together. So it's at the end of the 19th century that your reading for this week really gets going, the Václav Smil one. So I had you start with a brief excerpt from the previous chapter, historicizing the development of commercial fertilizer industries, coupled with the sort of neo-Malthusian realization that global demand for food was outpacing supply at current levels in the late 19th century. So in the 19th century, the prairies of Canada, the US, and Russia were really the last resorts. And it was clear that they wouldn't be able to keep up with the needs of growing, industrializing populations. So you've got a discussion of some successful efforts to create potassium and phosphorus-based fertilizers in the mid 19th century. At the time, the dominant consensus was that these two elements alone were what was needed for increased plant growth. The understanding of nitrogen's role, again, was still in its infancy. But once the role of nitrogen became better understood over the course of the 19th century, the ability to find outside sources of it was minuscule. So people knew they needed it. They knew that it was in certain kinds of manure and stuff, but they just didn't have enough of it to keep up with what they knew was being used up by crops. So guano, basically bat and bird poop that builds up in islands off the coasts of Peru, uh, um, and residues from steel mills were kind of the best sourced, and they represented less than 2% of what was removed via agricultural production globally. So your reading for this week quotes the British chemist William Crookes, who most clearly articulated the call to find better sources of nitrogen at the end of the 19th century. So, by the end of the 1800s, people knew they needed to get on this. And so they also had, the global scientific community that could really look at this. So at the beginning of the 20th century, then, it was actually Germans who perhaps heeded that call more than others. Not only was their need great because of a large population in a small geographic area, and by the end of the 19th century, there was actually a country called Germany. There wasn't at the beginning of the 19th century. So big population, small territories, so they certainly needed it for fertilizer, but some worried that with the intense militarization of the early 20th century, that when the inevitable war with Britain came, they wouldn't have the necessary ammonium nitrate for either weapons or synthetic fertilizers. Germany in the early 20th century also had one of the most well-developed chemical industries in the world. It still does, frankly. So large corporations like BASF eventually funded people like Karl Bosch and Fritz Haber to perfect a method to be able to fixate the abundant nitrogen naturally occurring in the air. I hope you enjoy the silly academic and personality politics that they had to wade through, as described in this chapter as well. But ultimately, the money of industry and the intense needs both for military and agricultural uses prevailed over any bruised egos. And on the eve of World War One, the Germans had a reliable method for ammonia production that was quickly replicated in other developed countries. Their method is still the primary way that nitrogen is synthesized today, though we do it more efficiently. So in the foreword to I included the foreword, a little snippet of one chapter, and then a chapter that really deals with Fritz Haber. So in the foreword, Václav Smil does a nice job hinting at some of the longer term negative effects of our massive nitrogen use today. So today, the massive amounts of carbon emissions that come from synthetic nitrogen synthesis have certainly worried environmentalists and organic farmers. Um, the overuse of synthetic fertilizers, and within organic agriculture, there's to be certified organic, one cannot use synthetic fertilizer. They need to use exclusively organic methods to get the nutrients they need for plant health. That's really one of the key reasons that the term organic is used in organic agriculture. So, yeah, creating synthetic fertilizer, lots of carbon emissions, and the overuse of synthetic fertilizers has also helped spawn the environmental movement of the 1970s as countries around the world have enacted measures to protect their waterways from excess nitrogen runoff. And so some progress has been made since the 1970s, but the nitrification of waterways and oceans in particular remains a serious problem, affecting ocean life and ultimately the future sustainability of our planet. So many of you in the sustainability program could actually end up working in for places like the New York City watershed, which is really one of the best maintained, cleanest water supplies in the world, and a model of sustainable management. So let me switch on to the next. All right, we're going to put my face next to the plow. All right, do a little face there. So the early 20th century was also an incredible period in the advancement of agricultural mechanization. So Conklin's chapter on American agriculture and Mazoyer and Boudard's on global, though really mostly French agriculture, fit together really well here. One of Conklin's driving theses is that for most of the history of American agriculture, the limiting factor has not been land or nutrients, it's been labor. So American and to a similar extent Canadian, Argentinian, Brazilian farmers all looked for ways to minimize labor rather than to intensify cultivation as people in areas with limited land and resources do. So Americans in particular had access to more than enough land, something that obviously Native people didn't appreciate. But in antebellum, meaning before the Civil War, America, it was even common to farm a piece of land until the soil was exhausted, then simply move on to a new farm. So the labor deficit in American agriculture became especially acute after the passing of the Homestead Act, which gave American families 160 acres of land in the West and Midwest. So this was more than any family could possibly handle on their own with, early 19th century technologies. So the earliest innovations, especially in the United States of America, were meant to cut down on labor. So the biggest job for homesteaders in the West, for people opening up the Midwest, the biggest initial job in working tough prairie soils is plowing. I love the discussion on plows. The best thing to come out of the American Industrial Revolution pre-Civil War was the improved moldboard plow with replaceable shares and a preceding cutting wheel. You've got pictures of This looks like a two-bottom plow from probably the 1950s or something that I included in the picture here. But when you plant a garden, you know you've got to dig up and turn the soil over. Then you kind of have to chop it up nicely until you get really good tilth necessary for planting. So the idea of a moldboard plow, one that cuts into the soil, then it's curved in such a way that it turns it over in one single operation. Frankly, that's as old as the Romans. That wasn't a new idea, but for millennia, it never really worked. A good moldboard plow had not been produced. So an American inventor, John Deere, was the first to be able to create an effective moldboard design out of much more durable steel rather than cast iron, and to effectively add replaceable shares to the front. So if you look right here, the share, that's what cuts, that's what breaks the most. You plow into a giant rock that's not going to move, you're going to break a plowshare. So, but before John Deere, when a cast iron plow broke in heavy soil, you were done and you needed a new plow. But replaceable shares meant you could easily replace the pointed part of the plow that breaks most frequently. The John Deere design also greatly reduced the power needed, making it possible to cover much more land in a day than what had previously been possible. Personally, there's nothing I love more about farm work than plowing sod. Watching the plow bottoms dig into the soil and, immediately become shiny as they're just traveling through. And then watching a stubby green field turn rich black is, for me, one of life's greatest joys. So the John Deere plow, though, was possible because of improved steel production. This steel production, coupled with the inventiveness of American and Canadian manufacturers in particular, eager to satisfy an insatiable demand, led to some of the coolest innovations in the 19th century. I'll switch to some more fun pictures. I'll put myself down here. Okay. So this the next most labor intensive job on farms was harvesting grains. So in the 1830s, Cyrus McCormick first came up with the idea of a sickle bar to cut grain. It's got, I mean, you can see a picture of one right here. It's got teeth in front of it, and then, well, it's got like guards, metal guards, and then teeth that move back and forth, and it causes a scissor motion. And these early ones were driven by ground power, just basically geared in such a way that the movement of the wheel as pulled by horses causes these knives to cut against each other. And I included a picture of a sickle bar mower rather than his whole reaping machine, because you've got that in your reading for this week. So this sickle bar to cut grain, also applied to cutting hay. It remains a popular mechanism on hay binds to this day, and you can actually still buy sickle bar mowers that look just like this, except they typically run off of a tractor's power takeoff instead. So McCormick, he would start a reaper making factory in Chicago, where he and others came up with other innovations like a reel to better move grains onto the cutting bar. Eventually, automatic systems for separating and winnowing heads of grain and corn would be developed, along with mechanisms for baling hay. You've got a hay baler down here. But this was all done by the end of the 19th century, virtually all of which were horse-drawn. So these labor-saving mechanisms were absolutely incredible. By the middle of the 19th century, American wheat, because of this, was the cheapest in the world because of American productivity. This had negative effects in other places. In Russia, for example, the cheap availability of American cereals drove landowners to export wheat at rates that were so uncompetitive that they led to late 19th century famines in Russia, completely avoidable, even though Russia and what is today Ukraine arguably have the most fertile soil in the world in their Black Earth regions. So by the end of the 19th century, virtually every implement used on modern farms had been invented. discs and harrows, cultivators, manure spreaders, cutting bars, threshers, even combined harvesters and threshers, what we call a combine today, balers, rakes, tedders, corn pickers, and complicated seed drills were all widely available. I've got an early picture of Jethro Tull's, not the band, but the inventor, 18th century seed drill, which, using what they had available then, um, wasn't as good as the kind of seed drills that, could have multiple rows together by the end of the 19th century. But the idea of not having to plant by hand, but being able to use a machine to do it, to have perfectly straight rows, it's a really important innovation. So what was lacking though was traction. Oh, wait, 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 wait. Here we go, back here. All right. Early steam-powered tractors. I'll put my face up here. Had been used on an experimental basis since after the Civil War, but these cumbersome beasts typically weren't effective for field work, as they were so heavy that they would just compact the soil. So some early steam tractors were actually used more for their flywheels here than which could pull plows across fields with pulleys rather than actually moving over the fields. So the real innovation came with the availability of internal combustion engines by the 1890s. So early gasoline, kerosene, and later diesel tractors were still problematically heavy and prohibitively expensive. But innovations like the power takeoff, a PTO, a sort of transmission that comes out the back of a tractor that can be used to power implements, suddenly made the tractor extremely economical. Early Oliver, Fordson, John Deere, Case, and Farmall, among many other brands of tractors, became widely available by the 1920s in the United States. And after World War II, most American farmers had access to tractors. On the eve of World War II, the world was ready to adopt tractors. It was really just more a question of availability and affordability. So Mazoyer and Boudart, they call this era of the era of moto mechanization, and they briefly discuss the transformations of moto mechanization. I'm sure it sounds better in French, in 5 different stages, with the final involving large four-wheel drive tractors and massive self-propelled harvesters. I like the specific figures they use. France is, of course, and I'm not quizzing you on them or anything, but France is of course much smaller than the United States, as are their farms. But one thing I love about Delaware County, New York, is how many old tractors are still around and regularly used. We're still in an earlier era of Mazoyer and Boudart's moto mechanization. At least many small farms are. There are obviously big farms in Delaware County as well. The farm where I do hay in the summer has a couple newer utility tractors, level 3 tractors, I'd say. But I do as much as I can with their zippy little level 1 or maybe level 2, according to Mazoyer and Boudart. 1949 Ferguson TO30, zippy little tractor. It's a lot like the Ford 2N. Um, okay, so another of the innovations that they deal with is selective breeding of livestock. And we'll deal with the genetic modification and selective breeding of plant species in 2 weeks, but briefly, it's just fun to see the changes in animal husbandry over the last century. Milk and egg yields per animal are vastly greater than they were 100 years ago. Meat animals are typically larger and more efficient at converting feed to meat than they were a century ago as well. I remember as a kid, my mom had an old 4-H booklet that I believe belonged to her father that described the major livestock breeds in the United States. I just remember giggling when I'd look at how small the sheep and pigs of the same breeds that we have today were a century ago. So there's been massive improvement in the animals that are part of our food systems. So a final element to this agricultural revolution, even before the Green Revolution of the 1950s, was really sustained, serious government support. Conklin has a good discussion of land grant universities like SUNY Cobleskill just up the road from us, then agricultural research stations, then the establishment of county extension offices, coupled with support for organizations like 4-H and FFA. This is a fun picture of and FFA used to stand for Future Farmers of America, but they did a goofy rebranding thing in the 1990s, and now it's just FFA. Many companies have done that. It's silly. But this is a picture of an FFA maple syrup evaporator being run by Delaware Academy students back in 2011. They do an amazing job with maple production here. And I remember when I was first raising sheep on my own, I called my dad a few times with really basic production questions, and every time I asked him something, he would say something to the effect of, "I don't know, I don't farm anymore. Call your county agent." And eventually I learned to stop calling him with farm-related questions, just to call the county agent. And I was absolutely grateful for Jim Otchersky, the county agent of Cornell Cooperative Extension for Schuyler County when we were there. All right, so this week was really a celebration of progress in primarily American agriculture. It's a story of anti-Malthusian hubris and exponentially increasing yields and productivity. This American experience also set a standard that other places, especially quickly developing state socialist countries, would try to mimic with top-down edicts. We're going to read about those efforts and their consequences in the Soviet Union, then China, next week and the following. And fair warning, next week is not going to be an agricultural love fest like this week has been. So, all right, here are some bonus questions for you to try your hands at. And as always, please reach out to me if you want to talk about anything at all. All right, have a good week, everyone.